Welcome everybody to the next installment of the modules feedback sessions. It should be, or hopefully will be, quite a short session today, but let's just see. First of all, just want to briefly talk about the modules roadmap and give an update on what we're focusing on right now and what's sort of coming up next. And then talk about the modules proposal and how we're proposing to put that into the likely accept state and what that actually means as well. So briefly, firstly, on the modules roadmap side of things, the modules roadmap linked from the slides as usual, which we'll share after this. The last couple of weeks have actually required us to focus a tiny bit more to finish up on the changes that Rog talked about last time. And we've since the last session, we've done 2 releases for Alpha 3 and Alpha 4. So we'll just briefly cover what went into each of those releases. But on the last session, Rog talked about adding the source field to the module.q file and what that actually means, and how we're going to use that to drive the contents of a module file. So that has now actually been released in the course of Alpha 3 and Alpha 4, added a couple more features on top that help make working with that additional field a bit easier. We haven't in the last couple of weeks managed to do any work on the integration tests for known OCI registries. That's sort of something we are tangentially running into the whole time, though, as in we're interacting with different registries as our users of Q modules. So we're aware of the fact that people are raising problems with some registries, but by and large, folks are getting on just fine with the well-known registries. But we want to lock that down with integration tests. And so that issue sort of remains outstanding until we've locked them down with some integration tests. In the background, behind working on the source field, we're also chipping away at the plans for the central registry, and in particular, this generation of, the schemas from things like Go sources of truth or JSON schema. And Rustam has also got a proof of concept, which we won't demo today because we want to talk a bit more about the modules proposal, but we will next time for the generation of documentation from particularly Q schemas. That's where we're going to start on that side of things. So we'll have a demo of that working on the central registry next time. And we also need to, we haven't actually gotten around to that, pull together a public roadmap of what we have planned for the central registry separate from the modules roadmap, because the two are sort of quite different. They've got different release cycles. As I mentioned, we've done 2 releases since last time. Alpha 3 was probably the larger of the 2 from the perspective of modules. I'm going to look to Daniel here to sort of correct me where I misstep on any of this. Rog talked about this in detail last time. QMod published now requires that source field. For example, we're thinking it's probably going to be most common for folks to have Git as a source of truth for their modules that they wish to publish. Particularly when collaborating with others, that's likely to be the case, that you've got a VCS behind the work that you're actually doing. Certainly, we're not limiting this to Git, but Git probably being the most popular of the VCS systems out there, this felt like a decent starting point. The module docs on qlang.org have been updated to indicate how Git as a source field is actually used, and we can actually after this we'll make sure we include some links to those docs as well. Qmod init ---- source is therefore a convenience to allow you to set that particular field when you're creating a module. And Qmod edit is there really as a sort of a means of, in a sort of more tooling automated fashion, setting the source field, for example, after you've actually created a module. So there should be no editing by hand required in these situations. You should be able to do it all tooling wise. Another thing that's coming in Alpha 3 and Alpha 4, and we're also going to roll out to the central registry as well, is that language.version is now a mandatory field in a module.q file. And that really, this is following the style of Go and what they have with the Go directive in the Go module. What that allows us to do is to start to control how we interpret modules based on that language version, amongst other things. It will also enable us to turn on or off certain features within Q. For example, if we add or if we make backwards incompatible changes, we can gate that based on the language version in a module.q. So this is actually quite a powerful technique. Again, we're we're borrowing a lot here from the experience of the Go project and how they have sought to maintain backwards and forwards compatibility and do so in a controlled way. So really, I think we should actually probably just link to the docs, link to the backwards and forwards compatibility statements on the Go side of things for what we're trying to emulate on Q here. In our own way, language.version is the way that we'll be doing that. QMod publish is where we have VCS as a source field. We're also including VCS metadata. This isn't something that's actually surfaced yet. Obviously, if you publish it to an OCI registry, the OCI registry will see the metadata that is included. It's just the commit SHA and the date from memory, but the proposal 3057 actually details that. Our plan is with the central registry and other sort of aware registries, what we're going to do is where there is VCS metadata available, we're actually going to then attest that module once we've done a check from the central registry to say, and yes, this GitHub repo did contain this commit and it contained exactly the files as were attempted to be published. It's a sort of like a cross check in this situation. And of course, that's not limited to GitHub. We can have sort of any source of truth in there and have an attestation that confirms, yes, this publicly available module was current in VCS or was present in VCS at the time that someone sought to publish it. We need this really because it's a sort of the way in which the OCI model works here is different to say Go, where Go pulls from a VCS repository as the source of truth, and then the proxy sort of snapshots it, and then that is set in stone for forever once it's snapshotted. So we sort of effectively achieve exactly the same thing that the Go proxy does. But what we'll use for this is likely uses attestations, really very much following the model of other registry-based setups out there, where you can attest anything you like. And one of the attestations will be, we found this module in VCS at the commit that is present in the metadata. So then people can have, from like a supply chain security perspective, some confidence that actually, yep, it was present in VCS at some point in time. Finally, the Q registry, we now have a special none registry. Roger talked a bit about this last time, so we can refer folks to the notes from last time for a bit more detail on that one. Alpha 4 was also released. QMod publish. Now we're sort of trying to better surface what files go into a module and also where the module will be published to. And so QMod publish has dry run with JSON and out flags to help surface that information. QMod resolve is a command is there to ask effectively the Q registry config configuration, where would this module resolve from? Because of course so the non-standard situation where you have multiple registries configured, maybe just two, but certainly more than one, then of course you might be very concerned or interested in where a particular module would resolve from without actually reaching out over the network to do that. And so QMod resolve does so in a static way, which is sort of like a convenience thing. I saw a couple of comments come in. Anything to jump onto right now? Daniel, Richard, can language versions, Richard, please jump in if you want to right now, because we can happily talk about it. Can language versions be different? Sorry, Daniel, go for it.
So I believe we wanted to follow what Go does, which is language versions get MVS applied to them, much like dependency versions. So at least in the Go world, if you declare Go 121 and you use a dependency that declares Go to 122 as a later language version, then you get bumped to 122. Because if you're compiling the dependency for 122 and that uses newer language features, you cannot build anything on top of that on an older language version. We want Q to have the same semantics, but I cannot actually remember if we already implemented this.
I can't either. It's a good question, and one we should check.
It's an open issue.
Oh, perfect. Okay, there we go.
So yeah, just follow that. But yes, that we should just do what Go does.
And also as well, I guess, with QList, which is there as an open issue as well, we'll be able to surface this sort of information about modules And so if you wanted to verify that none of your dependencies, for example, required Q version 0.10 or greater, you'd be able to use QList to query all of your dependencies and run those sorts of checks as well. Any sort of analysis that you would like on them. Cool. Okay, and then Daniel also just flagging that we're likely to do a release candidate of 0.9.0 next week. Exactly. Because whilst there's one issue we just need to give some attention to from a modules perspective for 0.9, which is checksums. We won't necessarily implement that. We just need to be clear of what we would implement before we release 0.9. Okay, so the next section is the modules proposal itself, moving it to a likely accept state. So I think I can't actually remember when we first announced the V3 of the modules proposal. I think it may have been towards the end of last year, early part of this year, but feedback, especially for those who were on this call, Richard and Noam, especially, who have been kicking the tires heavily on the actual implementation side of things, plus others, hugely appreciated. There's been some really good feedback, not only just bug reports, but also folks saying, yeah, this is working really well for us, whether using the central registry or just a custom in-company registry, whatever it might be. That feedback's been really good, and we've not run into any major concerns from our perspective. Certainly the bugs that have been reported, or the problems that have been reported, for example, with the modules files changes that we made over the last couple of weeks, that's naturally sort of built on top of the proposal in 2939 and the associated sub-proposals. So that's given us a fairly good degree of confidence that actually the proposal as it is there, being OCI based, and with all the sort of the bells and whistles that we describe in the proposal itself, is a good building block. It's not the complete thing, but we're actually pretty comfortable as well that we can build atop that proposal with further implementation. For example, I talked about checksumming process and how that would work. Again, it's not necessarily going to be the case that we implement that before we accept the proposal, just that we have to have a good line of sight on how we would do it, and that the direction of travel is good. The reason it might be fair to ask, well, why are you rushing to sort of accept the proposal? Well, we're not really looking to rush to accept the proposal. It's just more where the evidence is there that says that this is all heading in the right direction. It's a good signal to those who are keen for the module side of things to move out of this experimental phase, to indicate to folks, yep, we're committing to this now and we're going to move forward with it. And that just then allows others to build on top of modules in a more well-defined way. Talked earlier on about the work that we're doing on the generation side of things. So for example, generating from different sources of truth. Again, we don't see that as being work that has to happen ahead of accepting the modules proposal, because we have good line of sight on how that will work within the modules proposal. Or put another way, the modules proposal doesn't block us or paint us into any corners when it comes to that side of things either. So we'll absolutely keep, that's really the number one priority in any case, is that generation use case, and making those sort of published modules available via the central registry is the thing that we are, now that Roger's sort of finished up with Alpha 3 and 4, the thing that we return to when Roger returns from holiday next week. So what does this mean in terms of the proposal itself? Well, the proposal's been out there for a while. We've been having these sessions to discuss any feedback, updates, whatever it might be, any concerns people might have. We've been loosely following the Go proposal process, which I link there, which is much more structured in terms of, they have like a Kanban board of as things move through the life cycle of the proposal process. We've been much more loosely following it, for starters, because we don't have a Kanban board. One of those stages in the Go proposal process is that you signal to folks that we are likely to accept something. And what that basically means, and Daniel, please jump in with any sort of information to complement this, is that all the evidence that's there publicly, and that's why we've had these sessions publicly with updates to issues, discussions, etc. All the evidence points towards the proposal being a sound one, and one on top of which we can build a healthy Q modules dependency management ecosystem. So based on that evidence that's there in public and everyone can see it, it sort of feels like the right thing to do to therefore accept this proposal. But what Go does is they instead of saying, oh, we're just going to accept it, they signal they're likely to accept it, which then gives sort of a final period for any comments, concerns that might change that sense of consensus that actually this proposal should be accepted. So as of today, and we'll sort of signal this in 2939 in the sub-proposals, we're moving to this likely accept phase, which does just give folks the opportunity to chip in and say, hey, I've got a bit of a concern here or a blocker here. We just sort of bring those to the surface as by sort of setting a deadline, as it were, that we've now got a couple of weeks. We've got a couple of weeks for folks to raise these concerns. They've had a number of months to raise them, but as always, it's nice to have a forcing function to get people to surface these sorts of comments. So if folks do have any feedback or concerns, any of the discussions would be fine, or in the Slack channel, whatever, we'll get onto it straight away. The aim to be that we conclude this decision, i.e. we move it to an accept at the next modules feedback session in 2 weeks' time. So again, setting a deadline, not to rush things, but really to just force to act as a forcing function for people to speak for now. Of course, if people still have concerns after we've accepted, it's not like we'll ignore them. It's just that we do need to give some sort of clarity of whether we're moving, if and when we're moving out of the experimental phase. I saw a Richard question, would acceptance mean the modules would move out from behind this feature flag? Yes, it would. So it would no longer be an experiment, as and when we accept the proposal. Let's just say there's an alpha that follows a week after that. I'm just sort of making up if there is such an alpha. We would drop the experiment flag, i.e. would remove that guard. It would no longer be experimental within the open source Q project. The central registry will remain experimental. As I said, that's sort of in like a different release cycle altogether. So we continue to want to kick the tires on the central registry, but you can sort of, in that respect, consider the central registry as a different experiment. It's just another OCI server with a whole load of Q bells and whistles. But yes, Richard, you're absolutely right. It would move that from behind the feature flag. So then we'd be able to, let's just say that alpha then gets released in an actual release, not a pre-release. Then we would update all the docs on qlang.org to remove the need to set Q experiments as well, just for anyone who's perhaps between the latest version or the pre-release version. So that's the plan. If anybody has any concerns with that, so that we can quickly move to Q&A now. But otherwise, after this call, we'll do a brief update to all of those. Daniel, please.
My question is quite similar to Richard's, and it's right now, I understand that we have some APIs that are experimental for modules, like in qload config. But what about the command Q interface? Because we have things like qmod publish that are marked as experimental, meaning we could delete that command. But I assume that we should also drop that experimental node on them.
Yeah, I think so. I think what we need to, accepting the proposal sort of doesn't mean the next day we would take the experimental flag off everything. I think it's just we then sort of set the direction of travel on it. And so then it might be that we do things in a phased way. So rather than rip it all out from being experimental day one, we say, oh, we're still not quite sure of the API around qmod publish. Let's just use that as an example, the command line API, that is. So let's just keep those things as experimental for now, just as that signal to folks, we're hardening up the API here in a bit. But at least the proposal itself, being marked as accepted, is more just a signal to folks of the direction of travel than everything, and then we can sort of gradually wean ourselves off the experimental pieces as they firm up as well. But again, the nice thing is that if we have the language version in there, if we do need to make breaking changes, which we absolutely want to keep to a minimum, then we can do so in a safer way by using the language version to help from an API perspective to an extent. So. If anybody else has any questions, I'm sorry, I've been talking for a long time.
Jonathan has one in chat.
Oh, yeah. It's an interesting question. So just voicing the question for the benefit of those who are watching the recording. Jonathan sort of pointing out that we can go back to the slide actually. Here with QMod publish adding the --JSON flag. Jonathan's saying that given this is the Q language, it sort of feels like a bit of a backward step to have a --JSON flag. If I was to sort of read between the lines a tiny bit there, as opposed to Jonathan suggests, a extra info. Whilst we could definitely bike shed over the extra info, I think it's a point that's probably well received in terms of the --JSON maybe not sitting entirely well with the fact this is the Q language. But I just offer one point, Jonathan, is that if it's --JSON, what it does do is, or -out equals JSON is another one that Daniel suggested there is, the JSON default that I think we've sort of reached for there just allows other tools to consume the output from it. It's obviously not impossible to say that if it output Q, then you could run it through QExport to export from Q to JSON for a tool that consumes the JSON. So I think we can definitely it'd be nice if you don't mind raising an issue around that, Jonathan, please, for us to just sense check that a tiny bit before we really commit to it. I think Daniel raises a good suggestion on how we could alternatively do it there by controlling the formats. Because yes, maybe the default should be Q, but that you then have the ability to say, I would like it to output JSON for those tools that would otherwise just consume JSON. That's a very fair point. I think it's the Go heritage here. A Q default wouldn't be bad because we do it in a number of places. Jonathan says that he didn't mention a Q default. You didn't, but at the same time, I forget which of the modules related commands it is that Rog rather cleverly and sneakily just got it to spit out Q, which is very human readable because you don't have to quote, you don't have to have the surrounding braces, you don't have to quote the field names. And it looks just like some very nicely structured logging in the command output, but it's actually valid Q as well. So it's a rather nice way of getting some structured output is to output it as Q. If there's no other questions, we can sort of wrap things up in good time. And I can busily go away and mark the proposals as likely accept. I will just reiterate the thanks to especially Richard and Noam, because they're on the call, for having kicked the tires so aggressively on the module side of things. It's really accelerated the way in which we can get all this module stuff done. So delighted that us releasing new versions every week at times has been met with such eager testing on the other side. So thank you very much. And Cedric, I will just note, given you're on the call as well, that it was a number of calls ago where you talked about, we were talking about the generation of Q modules from different sources of truth. And you made a comment about how really there's interaction with, in the most general case, other build systems. That comment is still very much in our heads as we're going through all those conversations. And so when we, and again, we will aim to do this next time, surface a bit more of our thinking around the generation side of things and the sort of the pieces that need to exist in that space. It will very much touch on that point because it's certainly stuck with me ever since you mentioned it. I think it must have been a month ago when we last talked about it.
Yeah, I was going to ask a question about that, but it seems like you're ready to discuss it more in the next meeting. That's fine. It seems very related to capturing those common things like Kubernetes. So looking forward.
Yep, it actually goes, I think, far beyond that. It's sort of in the abstract case, it's just a way of some other system saying this is the thing that's been built. But certainly that's how I understood your comment. Mm-hmm. And this is the thing that is therefore I'm using or has been deployed. And it just, yeah, it resonates very nicely. And so then working out sort of a Go module, go.mod is a very special case of that in some way, shape or form. But in the general case, as you pointed out, it could be some other build system. And so that's been a really good model for how all this stuff has been holding together.
Right. And I think it's because, since we're dealing with data, not just specific programs, we need a lot more flexibility. And that's something that's going to be needed for configuration.
Yep, definitely. Cool. Okay, thank you, everybody. We'll publish the recording of the meeting, the session, as well as the notes. And I'll go through and update the proposal and sub-proposals now. Thanks, everyone, and see you in a couple of weeks' time.